Okay, so my strategy is recipe writing. Recipe writing is a creative strategy that can be used to recall and to just dig deeper into a concept. Writing to Learn is a pedagogy that actively involves students across disciplines in the construction of their own knowledge through writing. So, what is recipe writing? It is a creative way to dig deeper into concepts and processes that can relate throughout different content areas. So, one thing that is important to point out is that I do call this strategy a mapping strategy because it does follow a specific format, and I think that that format almost is like a map, and that if we follow it, then we can really get engaged into it. This strategy is adapted from raft writing, found in our book of 50 strategies, and it's a creative way for students to focus on vocab and key terms, and most of all, to practice content application. Another way to think of it is a mix between concept maps and process maps, because you do really dig deep into a concept. You can break it down, and then you want to think about how that concept is processed to be recreated. Recipe writings have three important parts: the title, which is the concept being covered. That title can also be represented by a math problem or a historic event, or maybe an artistic skill like watercolor painting, which is an example we will see later. But the title is something is really just telling what the concept map will be about. The ingredients are the list of elements related to the concept. So if we have a math problem, the ingredients can include maybe variables and equation signs, some of the steps or the thought processes that are involved in finishing this math problem. A calculator could be a step. Really, it's up to the teacher and maybe the students as well to decide how exactly they will characterize the list. And then the instructions are the process, the how, the what are we going to do to turn our ingredients, our calculator, our equations, and our problem into a solved algebraic function or expression. So, yeah, the instructions can be pretty abstract. I mean, the whole strategy can be abstract, and that's why what I really like about it is because it can be really fit into many different scenarios, which is why it's a great content literacy strategy. So we'll see other ways about how it can be used differently. In our next example, actually, we see that we can use recipe writings to think about the process that it takes to create a watercolor painting. So this can be used in an art classroom. Maybe we can list out in the ingredient section, talk about the actual materials that a student will need to create a watercolor painting, like paintbrushes and paint and an easel and certain types of paper. And that way we can allow the student to show us that they are aware of the specific details that are involved in this process. So then we move on to our steps in our process, and this is when the student will walk us through how they will use their ingredients to create an actual watercolor painting. So the steps in the process just ask students to put the ingredients to work and to describe the logic that will lead to the concept. So once again, you can really get creative in these sections. Okay, so there's a format, that map that I was referring to, and you want to begin with the concept, which can be an event, a historical event, a math problem, or an event from a literature source like a book. So this can be used, of course, in English, math, and science class. And then you think about the goal and the task that you want to achieve, and then that can compose your concept. Then you move on to the ingredients, which are the elements related to the concept. So for a math problem, we talked about how we could have variables, or maybe for science, if our concept was the scientific method, we would probably list out the 5 parts of the scientific method in our ingredients list, like the hypothesis and the research and the methods and the results, those could all be a part of the ingredient section. And then in our process, we would talk about, if we're sticking with our example of the scientific method, we will talk about how each of those 5 ingredients are used in that scientific method. So you can really just go into detail about that method, and the process is what you would describe in that later part. And for elementary math, we have an example. We can talk about the simple things like maybe pencil and paper, but you can get more specific and you can talk about the actual problems that can be in your ingredient section. Also, the actions. The actions are always good to add into the ingredient section. You can talk about the specific actions that the student will do. Well, the student will list the actions that they will do to complete their problem, such as counting on their fingers, raising a hand for help, using their counting sticks. And this is an elementary example, so that's why I referenced counting sticks there. And then we move on to our process. How are we going to use these ingredients or put them all together, work them all together to solve this addition problem? And then we can say things like, you start with your 10 problems with pencil. And I mean, that does sound pretty elementary, which is fitting for this example, but as you can imagine, you can really adjust this and create a rubric that lets your students know what you expect and make it really detailed to fit your content area. So for history, we can think about creating a recipe for a historic event, or maybe a timeline for a historic event. So to do that, you would need things like the setting, the people involved, the conflict would be something that could be good to go there, other factors that contributed to this event. And then in your process section, you would just line those events up, line up those details, and lead up from the beginnings of this historical event to the ending. And that can be done in however many steps. That is, the number of steps in the process section is something that the teacher can set out for the students. So this recipe can flow a bunch of different ways. I mean, when we're talking about history or a lot of other things like a science project, it can go a lot of different ways, and it's really just up to what we as the teachers decide to set out for our students in the rubric. We can tell them to be creative, we can tell them to be a little bit more straightforward. You have that wiggle room with this strategy. So what is the process? I think that this is something that I would review with the students, and I would just do it to fit your content area once again. A process is a set of actions that reach a certain end. There are instructions that you follow. So that's what we want to remind our students that they're listing in that process section. They're telling us the instructions on how they can solve an algebra problem, or how to do a layup in PE, or how to find a book in the library. They're listing out those instructions, and before they list those instructions, they want to give us the ingredients. So for the example about finding a book in the library, the ingredients would include a book, maybe a Dewey Decimal System, maybe the actions of going to the library, talking to a librarian. I mean, you can really just kind of go out of the box with these ideas. Okay, and then we want to talk about just the creativity in this strategy, and then the steps on how to start it. So modeling is important. You can model with simple recipes. And I say simple because you don't want to use a very advanced recipe and then students get caught up on the actual idea of a food recipe. You want to just show them that the format is what you're looking at. Recipes have a title, they have ingredients, and they have instructions. And although they can vary from that basic format, that's what you want students to grasp. And then once again, you can always tweak this to fit your classroom needs. The real life application that I want to review with you all, because I did use this with my students and I was very, very excited about how it turned out and the results that I got. So I do have a student example. And we did this recipe strategy to complete our unit on unity. We were talking about apartheid, and that is a period in South Africa where people were separated by their race and by their social status and economic status. So there's a lot of separation. And with that, we talked about the changes that we would have brought to South Africa at this time. So I asked my students to create a recipe for change. And this was one of the slides that I showed them. And I said, I want you to think of a positive change: unity, peace, love, togetherness. And I want you to think about how you can be that change that you want to see in the world. And then with that, I had my students, they created a recipe for social change. One student chose to do a recipe for unity, and I really love that one of his ingredients was one man or woman in the mirror. I thought that was pretty strong, just for showing that deep thought. And then a kind heart and caring personality, and then you can read the rest of the ingredients. And they listed those ingredients because they knew that that would be what we would really need to see a change in the world. And those were pretty head on ingredients for creating that positive change in the world. So the ingredients can include actions, characteristics, and tasks, and people. And then, yeah, this is for a humanities example, but once again, you can see how we can change this into something to relate to science and math. So then for the process section, the student began by saying, start with the man or the woman in the mirror and mix with respect and kindness. So we can see that recipe wording playing into our process. And in this section, students just give that descriptive list that details how their ingredients are connected and will come together in the recipe. Their ingredients will be manipulated in the process to reach a final product. And in this case, the final product is unity. So our student starts with a man and woman in the mirror, and they mix it with a kind heart, respect, and a positive attitude. And that is how they create unity. And other ways that you can get students ready for this strategy is I sprinkled it throughout my day with my students by in the agenda. I said 1 cup of bell work, a half a tablespoon of warm-ups. And you can just use that front loading strategy to really get students thinking, okay, how am I going to turn a practical everyday task like a math problem or the scientific method or finding a book in the library into a recipe? Well, by showing students how I did it in my agenda, I modeled for them. And that's what you want to do, is just find ways to model for your students. This is a recipe I created for a happy Mrs. Here, which is me. And it has things, I reminded my students that your ingredient list will not be tangible. Not everything will be tangible because you want them to think outside the box. So remind them that some things will not be tangible and some things will be pretty practical, like raising your hand or maybe doing research. And then in the black over here on the right, I have my process. So I tell how I'm going to mix my ingredients on the left. How am I going to mix them to reach my goal, which is a happy Mrs. Here? This is the rubric, the written detailed version of the rubric that I gave my students. And you can see I told them to start with the prep or the purpose, their goal, which is the concept. What do you want to do? What is that change you want to add to the world, and why? So for your students in math class, just ask them or present them with the problem or a mathematical function and ask them how are they going to find the square root of 64. And then they will list those ingredients. Well, we're going to need the number 8. That can be an ingredient. We're going to need the square root, knowledge of the square root. You can just kind of lead them to where you want them to go. And then it's always cool to see what they come up with. And then your instructions are just going to be those steps. Now, why do we write to learn? Well, we write to learn because writing to learn differs from the other types of writing because it is meant to be a catalyst for further learning. So to dig deeper, to really understand how things work, let our students show us that they understand the application of a concept, that they understand the depth of a vocabulary term. Writing to learn in this creative way can allow us to see our students really break down concepts beyond just reciting a definition. And then lastly, Given the complex ways in which writing intersects with participant interaction, it is of crucial importance to examine how writing